Welcome to Leeway 10 Pod, Series 2. My name is Luke Hereford. I'm an associate artist for Leeway Productions, and alongside some special guests, I will be hosting this series. Today's co-host is a theatre director and producer. She is head of arts at the British Council in Wales and is currently on sabbatical to the Barbican Centre in London, where she is senior producer looking after their busy creative learning department. With a strong interest in new writing, particularly from Wales, she started her career at Made in Wales Stage Company in Cardiff and then went to work for Michael Bogdanov at the English Shakespeare Company. She's also worked at National Theatre, producing and directing projects and productions for primary schools, including directing The Little Tempest by Leslie Ross and The Wonderful Life and Miserable Death of renowned magician Dr. Faustus, written by Carl Gross with music by Ansuman Biswas. She was Associate Director at Theatre Royal Plymouth for 7 years and then worked for the RSC as their International Education Associate, producing their first ever live broadcast, I, Sinner the Poet, by Tim Crouch, which was beamed to primary schools as part of the Cultural Olympiad in 2012. After working as a creative producer for Soho Theatre, she joined the British Council and now, probably most excitingly after that whistle-stop career tour, joins us for today's episode of Leeway 10 Pod. Hi, Rebecca Gould.
Hello, Luke.
How did you find that whistle-stop of your career, that little whistle-stop intro?
It was quite long, wasn't it? I mean, I've jumped around a lot. That's what that made me think. I should stay in one place more.
No, I think it's great. I think jumping around is great, especially in hindsight, where we haven't really been able to jump around for the last year. I think it's quite nice to sort of revisit those memories, maybe.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I have literally gone from being abroad once a month to just being in this room for...
Quite the change.
It's been quite a change.
So let's just talk a little bit about your experience of working on musicals specifically in South Wales before we introduce our guests.
I mean, I've always, been a huge musical theatre fan ever since I was a teenager, really. But I had my first sort of go at directing just a 20-minute musical written by the brilliant Welsh composer and book writer Leslie Ross and James Williams. And we took that up to Edinburgh, I think, in 1996. And I had one of those amazing Edinburgh experiences, where it kind of sold out and got 5 stars and did, incredibly well. It was only 20 minutes long, but so that was a really good start, I think. And then after that, I mean, I've come and, when I was directing, I've come and go with directing musicals. I directed a trilogy of 3 musicals when I was at Made in Wales at the Aberdare Coliseum, which was sort of with large groups of young people from Aberdare. The first one was written by James Williams again and Roger Williams, playwright Roger Williams, who was one of the Made in Wales canon of writers at the time. And then the second one was called Dare, was written by Tim Riley and also by Tracy Spottiswoode. And then the third one, which was called Word Gets Around, was based on the Stereophonics album. And so I lovingly say it was written by the Stereophonics and us. They didn't have an enormous amount to do with the rehearsals, but their mums all came to the first night, which was a pleasure.
That's amazing. That's amazing. Do you know, one of the first, I think possibly the first time I ever met you, actually, Rebecca, you and I had quite a large geek out about the NT's historic kind of legendary production of Carousel. And at that point, I'd been working in Welsh theatre for maybe like 18 months to 2 years. And I had never really found anyone sort of in the Cardiff arts scene, I guess, for want of a better term, who really enjoyed musical theatre in the way that I do, sort of growing up with it. So I guess it's just really interesting when I think about Welsh musical theatre, it doesn't seem like it's sort of there on the forefront as much as it perhaps could be, because I think there are a lot of people who do make, obviously, musical theatre in Wales, but I think there's something about it that seems to be held back.
I think you're right, and I am like you, Luke, a huge enthusiast, so and a bit of a geek. I read all the biographies and follow all the stuff on Twitter and all that kind of stuff. But actually, one of the things I think is really true in South Wales is that, of course, there's a huge amateur tradition of producing musicals, and for people like me who grew up with Orbit and Land of Musical Society back in the day and all those sort of. I think they do instill, certainly in the non-professional world, a kind of real love of musicals. And then in the valleys as well, I've got lots of mates who are at the Park and Dare doing musicals from young age and stuff. But it doesn't quite transfer, I think, into to an appreciation of it in the theatre, in our Welsh theatres,
Mm-hmm. No, I totally agree. And I definitely grew up in that sort of, that one, well, Amdram culture. And that's I think that phrase Amdram sounds derogatory, but I don't see it that way.
No, me neither. I absolutely loved it. It made me who I am.
Yeah, totally agree. What a great segue to introduce our guests, I think. Our first guest is Patrick Steed, a composer and lyricist from Cardiff, and his musicals include Stalking John Barrowman, Blink, and the in-development project Cooper's Hill Cheese Rolling and Wake, written with Mike Stocks, and which is due to be showcased in the Beam Musical Theatre Festival. As composer in residence for Hello Cabaret, his songs have been performed in the Wales Millennium Centre and Cardiff Open Air Festival. As a musical director, Patrick leads Technicolor, a choir that remixes songs from the musical theatre repertoire.
And our second guest is Tim Riley, who has been working as a composer, writer and workshop leader since 1990. He has written the music and lyrics for Gwent Theatre, Spectacle Theatre, Theatre Iolo, Sherman Cymru, Black Rat Productions. He was shortlisted, along with librettist David Cottis, for the Vivian Ellis Musical Writing Prize for A Man of Affairs, and he spent a year as composer in residence at Welsh National Opera, writing the librettos and music for several large-scale community operas and musicals. In 2011, Tim collaborated with South Wales playwright Frank Vickery to write Another Bite of the Apple, and he recently wrote the libretto and score for Half and Half, the Curry musical, which was staged at Wales Millennium Centre in 2015. Tim and I go back a long way. I produced Half and Half. He was also the composer and musical director for the 3 Shakespeares that I directed at the Cardiff Open Air Theatre Festival, and most recently we collaborated on Ceddiaeth, a Paul Hamlin funded project at the British Council, which was in partnership with BBC Now and which aims to teach primary school children foreign languages through drama and song.
Let's hear a little snippet of Tim's work with the Act 1 finale from Treason, written by Tim Riley and John Lovatt. Hello, Patrick Steed and Tim Riley. Nice to have you.
Nice to be here.
Hello.
I'm just going to dive straight in with a question for both of you. So how did you both start composing musicals?
So I think my journey kind of started in university. I studied at Cardiff University, the music department there, and that was all very kind of much classical composition. So I guess my composition journey started in that world. But once I left university, I kind of realised that maybe the classical world wasn't really for me anymore. It was definitely important for my kind of education, but I just kind of realised that it wasn't where I wanted to be spending the rest of my life. And I jumped into kind of the world of musicals, getting involved with lots of shows, and suddenly realised actually I want to mix these two together. I'd love the experience of composing a show. And I was leading a choir at the time, and two of my choir members were writers, Jude Garner and Naomi Chiefy, and we kind of met and said, hey, should we work on a show together? Let's come up with some ideas. And they came up with the idea of stalking John Barrowman whilst we were having a cup of tea, and we thought, hey, let's see if we can make this happen. And that was my kind of first journey into the world of writing musicals.
What about yourself, Tim?
Well, I was just thinking, I was quite a confused child, I have to say, looking back on it now. And when I left school, I sort of got into this strange situation where I loved theatre. I used to love the little shows that we used to put on at school and all that sort of stuff. And I loved music, and I played piano, and I was quite a good pianist, but there was no way I was going to go into a career as a professional pianist, because back then it seemed the only sort of career advice would be like, oh, you could go and train to be a pianist. And I thought, well, what would I then do? I'd then maybe just become a teacher. And in fact, ironically, I do an awful lot of teaching. But I was in one of those strange situations, and I left school with appallingly bad A-level results in music, physics and maths. So again, really not quite sure where I was going with anything. And I ended up going to the Bristol Vic Theatre School to train as a sound technician. And it was actually a stage management course, but it was kind of, that was the thing I was going to go into. And while I was there, I was just rubbing shoulders, obviously, with all these actors, and there was all sorts of activity going on outside of the main things that we were doing, and taking shows up to Edinburgh. And I just started writing bits of songs for things, and people just kept saying to me, oh, you're really good at this. And actually, I realised then that my lack of piano playing skills really didn't matter a jot, because they didn't want me for that. They wanted to play the songs, but they wanted you to write the songs, and that's really how it all started. And I actually came to Cardiff, and I worked for Sherman. I was a sound technician there, and again there was a postgraduate course, which is long gone now, that the university ran at the Sherman, and it was there that I met David Cottis and various people that I still know now. And I just started collaborating on things. And after about 18 months, I just handed my notice in. I just went off and worked for all these small TIE companies. But I suppose some of the subject around, funding a theatre is, I'm thinking back to then, there were quite a lot of small professional opportunities, that somebody like myself could get into.
It's really inspiring, actually, to hear both those stories, I think. And to just remember how you do sort of start out and how you get going. I think it's really, really beautiful to hear them. Mm-hmm. I was going to ask, as freelance composers, which you both are, what do you think are some of the challenges in the Wales arts sector when you're trying to make particularly new musical theatre happen?
Well, I would say it's probably nigh on impossible to make a living as a composer of musical theatre in Wales. I suspect it might be nigh on impossible to do it just about anywhere for that matter, so let's not be too down on Wales about that. But certainly for me, musical theatre has been something that has been an important part of my work, but it's almost been like a shop front for other things that I'm doing. Because for instance, one of the earliest things I did, the thing that I wrote with David Cottis, who was on the postgraduate course at the Sherman, we wrote this thing called A Man of Affairs, and we managed to get it shortlisted for the Vivian Ellis Award. And we were doing that in Chapter Arts Centre, and of course no money, no funding or anything for that. But a producer called Alison Hindle came along to see it and gave me a load of work at the BBC off the back of that. And there's been a number of little turns like that in the way. So, and it sounds really cynical, but you know what I mean? So it's like these are these projects that you really, want to do, and you devote vast amounts of time and energy, and either earn a pittance or end up, in fact, losing money on them. but they are the things that sort of hopefully mark you out as somebody that you might want to use for other musical projects. And off the back of that, I'm a busy composer, a teacher, a musical director. You take whatever work you can, but I have to say a relatively small amount of my income has ever been derived from writing musicals.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And what about you, Patrick? What do you think about some of the challenges and opportunities, I guess, in the Welsh arts sector?
In terms of kind of challenges, I think I've seen kind of perceptions change of kind of musical theatre over the past kind of 10, 15 years. But I know that when I've been looking for kind of like funding for shows in the past, I remember kind of getting to that kind of tick box of, what type of art form is your project, and I looked for the musical theatre box and it's just not there. And I remember kind of on different kind of application forms going, right, I'm going to do 33.33% music, and then the same for kind of acting and dance. And when it's when it is this amazing art form that does have all of these almost quite complicated rules that allow it to work and allow it to kind of fall together, it's strange when sometimes it's perceived as maybe not being its own individual kind of art form. And I've experienced that as well in terms of developing shows where maybe kind of people with experience of playwriting or kind of other elements but not necessarily musicals come in to look at it and kind of say, oh, so what are you trying to achieve here? Is this a play with songs, or is this like a concert? And I'm like, it's a musical which has its own kind of rules and things to kind of get involved with. But it's just amazing that kind of perception sometimes of what a musical is. What
is musical theatre is for me one of the most fascinating questions, because theatre is a kind of mixed salad of an art form anyway, isn't it? Just theatre, you just draw from whatever you can really in order to make the best theatrical experience. And so obviously music is one of the things, songs is one of the things that you would use in order to make the best theatre that you possibly could. And I often think that why doesn't Sondheim particularly, I guess, come out as sort of in the same sort of book or sentence as Peter Brook, for example? They're not as people who really understand what that act of theatre is and what that play in the air, that kind of relationship between the stage and the audience is. And yet they don't. They quite often at that level get separated, almost like they're not kind of not exactly not proper theatre makers, but they're not in the same bracket as those kind of theatre greats, And yet, as you just said, Patrick, when it comes to when you want it to be separate, because you want funders to understand that there's a whole different process to making a musical than to just making a straight play, they're not separate, which is it always seems quite ironic to me somehow.
I mean, how many times have you heard people say, "Oh, I don't like musicals"? I mean, you never hear someone. Have you ever heard someone say, "Oh, I don't like films"?
Yes, that's exactly it. That's exactly right. Yeah.
You might go, "I don't like gangster films," or "I don't," because straight away we're going to genres. But inevitably, genres are helpful to place things in, and then you can break the rules, can't you? Do all these sorts of things. But I always think when people say, "Oh, I don't really like musicals," and no, what you mean is you don't like, one, because you say you don't like musicals, you probably haven't watched very many, so you haven't probably got much point of reference, but maybe you just haven't seen the one that floats your boat, because some people really don't like musicals where there's a scene and everybody has a chat, and then they go into a song which explores some emotion or other, and then goes into another scene. And some people really don't like the sort of Sondheim-esque ones where things are, particularly the sort of almost through sung sort of one, and they go, "Oh, I just don't get what's all this. I like to have a proper song," And those are all legitimate points, but please don't say you don't like musicals unless you really have, generally got to that point.
Yeah, I mean, if you've seen every single one.
Yeah, and I don't buy that thing. Nobody bursts into song in real life. You go, no, that's why it's really good, because it's like you're saying you're not interested in escapism. I think you'll find most people are interested in escapism in some form or other.
Yeah, and yeah, you're already suspending your disbelief when you go and see a play anyway. So, do suspend it further? Why not? I think.
And everybody every day gets to the point where there are no words. Do you know what I mean? And wouldn't it be great if we could all just burst into song, because that's the only way to really express what it is that we want to say,
that is more or less what's happening in our household at the moment.
You can invite me over when we're allowed.
Yeah,
that sounds great. To make it a little bit more specifically about Wales, those more commercial pieces are very popular in Wales. The Millennium Centre and the New Theatre, they have the big touring shows. Obviously, when they're allowed to, they have the big touring shows, and they are successful. So how do you both think that we could be better at getting our audiences to see more homegrown pieces of Welsh musical theatre?
I think for me it's probably mainly about community and creating communities that support each other. I think that's probably it's probably a key thing for me and kind of what I've experienced. And things like Leeway has been amazing for connecting different writers and composers together and starting a community there. When I was composer in residence at Hello Cabaret, Dan Fulham, who kind of created it, was really nurturing a community of performers, and in kind of being part of that, it kind of meant that I was suddenly connected with all of these performers, and it's meant that whenever I'm working on shows, I've got those people to speak to and might sing some of my music, and I think it's all about kind of building those kind of communities so that when you kind of go to create something yourself, there are people there that are happy to kind of support you and spread the word. But I kind of always start from that kind of level. I have applied to kind of funding and things like that in the past, and sometimes I've been successful and sometimes I haven't, but almost I'll start with what's my community and how can I promote to them versus trying to promote to a world of people I don't know, and that just seems a bit too scary for me.
I think that thing about community, Patrick, is so important. I ran the Soho Young Writers group for a long time when I was in London, and that's the one thing we used to say to the writers then, is that it can be quite a solitary act, sort of writing, whether it be musicals or plays. You're sat at home, and actually the idea that you build a community is so important, that people who are going to speak truthfully and tell you honestly what they think and also support you and kind of be your cheerleaders. I just think it cannot be sort of overestimated how important that is.
Yeah, I think there's a gulf between the conception of a musical and something that is potentially commercially viable as well, isn't it? This is the other big thing, and there has to be that nurturing bit which comes from community at the start. So whether that's the Amdram community or just other penniless professionals or people that you've worked with in other theatrical and musical endeavours. And that's all very well, and it does seem that there is a certain amount of money around to develop ideas. I mean, I think development is. I know Rebecca agrees with me on this. It's musicals aren't written; they're developed. They're ideas that are developed, and often with a lot of people involved. And sometimes you may not like the way they're developed, but that's the process. And if you want to get something anywhere, it's got to be developed. But the problem comes, you reach this point where you're neither one thing nor the other. You've had some help and some funding to get it so far. But the problem is the project needs such a huge investment of time and money to get it to the next stage. And how can you make something that is going to be commercially viable? And I mean, for it to be commercially viable, it's either got to be so honed down that it has practically no overheads to it. So obviously that sort of can, good things can come out of that, but it's going to limit your options. Or you have to go the other way and bring in a name. And this is something I've explored a bit with Rebecca with our project before. It's really difficult getting to that next gap. It's a little bit like what happens with small businesses, I think, you see often people set up a little business and it's a fabulous little business. It works really well and everyone loves it and they support it. And then that person tries to grow the business and they go to maybe, and if it's a retail business, wherever it is, they might go to have several locations. And so many of these things just fail at that next stage. Before they get to the big time, if you like, the big business that everybody in the UK or the world has heard of. And I think that's exactly the same in musicals. They're these little things, and there's that middle ground. It's not about people being at fault here. It's just very difficult to break through to the next level. And that's certainly for me, somewhere I've been a number of times, and it's very difficult, and it takes either a huge stroke of luck or just a random input from somebody that can really influence something for it to go somewhere. And we're not very well placed in Wales to do that, unfortunately, because most of the people that can help you are somewhere else,
I think that's spot on, and I know we've spent a lot of time talking about this, Tim, as you mentioned, and I'm absolutely fascinated by how you make a hit musical in a way. And I watched it, when I was at the RSC with Matilda. Matilda was developed over 10 years by a subsidised theatre company who had enough money. I mean, I'm not saying it was, it wasn't full time, clearly, for 10 years, but, it took that long. And in fact, I was having this discussion with somebody yesterday, can you guarantee a hit is something which even if you spend 10 years on it, it's not guaranteed to be a hit. You can't make it a hit. I mean, Matilda was largely to do with the dream team of Dennis Kelly and Tim Minchin, but actually you can up the odds, if you like. And I think that the kind of putting it out there, testing it in front of an audience, trying it out, trying different people in it, all of those sort of things are very much part of what you need to do to guarantee that something is going to be as good as it can be. And I think that is a big problem, and I think it's a particular problem in Wales, if I'm honest, that actually if something is tried and tested, researched, developed, even if it attracts the audience that you want it to attract, or it has the impact that you want it to have, it's then very, very difficult to move it on to the next stage, as Tim just described, because of our funding system partly, but partly because we don't have enough of the right people here to do that, and there's quite often just not enough money. I mean, the financial decision is the artistic decision again and again. Where you decide to put the money is what happens artistically, and unfortunately we just don't have enough money, I don't think, here a lot of the time.
I sometimes think in Wales, and I'm really interested to see what you both think about it. Well, all three of you think about this, but particularly Rebecca and Tim, with your experience of half and half, but I sometimes feel like we're a bit scared of making work that is kind of popular or sort of the populist, maybe, or kind of successful. I'm just interested in what you think about that.
Well, I love populists, so I haven't got a problem with that, but because I think, as long as the quality is there, a populist is a fabulous thing. And
popular doesn't equal unintelligent, does it?
No,
and I think that's
not,
an important thing for us to remember.
It's about layers of meaning, and this is why musical theatre is such an exciting form, because you can bring so many different things to bear in terms of themes and music and styles and different art forms, and all those things are at your fingertips there. But it's also why it's incredibly elusive to get right.
It takes incredible skill to make something which is populist, which is appeals to large numbers of people. I mean, just incredible. And so I think there, you can have those sort of light bulb moments, where you just, you're going to make something really popular because you just have that brilliant idea. And I know, with Half and Half, we wanted to make a show for families, and we did everything we could to make it, appeal, a broad appeal to family audiences, I think. Because that, what's nicer than going to see a musical as a whole family? I think that's a lovely idea myself, I think the thing about Half and Half was that when Tim first, sent me the script, I just thought, oh my God, a musical about curry. Curry is my favourite thing in the world, right? This is going to be amazing. And I also thought, though, more seriously, that this was a fantastic opportunity to work with communities who were Welsh and of South Asian heritage. I've got a lot of friends who work in Indian restaurants in Cardiff, and they don't go to the theatre as often as I would like, is the reality. And a big part of that project, as well as developing the musical, was that we ran a very large community project with, brilliant young people at Channel View Leisure Centre and Butte Town Pavilion, and the workshops were an opportunity for us all, not just them, but for us all to share our experiences of immigration and hybrid identities and cultural fusion and all those things. But also that, the show was aimed at families, and we very much hoped that the young people would bring their families to a major arts venue that perhaps they were going to for the very first time. And Half and Half only played for 7 performances. It had an all South Asian cast and director and a mostly South Asian band. We played to around sort of 900 people, I think, but it was one of the most diverse audiences I've ever been in Cardiff. Amazing. And we did the whole thing on a small production grant from the from the Arts Council. I think it's clear to say that it was driven by passion, much more than anything else. And but it did feel like it was a genuine missing piece of the jigsaw in the art scene in Cardiff, in that it showcased stories from a minority community that is significantly underrepresented.
Surely that's a hit in and of itself, because it you set out to reach this community and you achieved that.
Yeah. And and the feedback was wonderful. The feedback from people who'd never been to Wales Millennium Centre before was, hugely positive. We did loads of vox pops and we had critical friends and all that kind of stuff. And I felt, I think I said earlier that I felt very similarly about Leeway's The Last 5 Years, which was one of the most beautiful musical theatre productions I've seen in Cardiff. And I think it deserved a much longer life, like Half and Half. I think these things have got more of an audience, they deserve a longer life, but it's that's really difficult to achieve, I think.
Patrick, this is a question for you. You had a project lined up to be a part of Beam 2020, which is one of the leading initiatives for new musical theatre in the UK. In an earlier episode, we had a conversation with Emily Gray from Mercury Musical Developments, and she said that they really take pride in encouraging all applicants of Beam to write from their personal experiences and allow that to dictate where their work goes and the kind of work that they write. Is this true of your work as a composer, would you say? Is it often personally led and inspired in some way?
I'm a gay man, so that's kind of something that's very much within me and something that and want to kind of bring to writing. It's interesting, when I wrote Stalking John Barrowman, the lead character was a gay man, and it was all set in Cardiff, and I feel like I could put lots of my kind of own energy into that. I think when I wrote Blink, I lost my way a little bit and I wasn't writing from personal experience, and I was kind of maybe trying to tell a story that wasn't really mine to tell. And to some extent, I'm still proud of what I created, but the reason why I haven't taken it further is I kind of thought, this doesn't feel right for me. I'm trying to do something that kind of doesn't fit my story. And with Cooper Silty's Rolling and Wake, in such early development kind of stages about that, there's still characters that we're not sure how they're going to fit into the story and all of that, but myself and Mike, we're writing it together, have definitely had these kind of conversations about our personal experiences and what we want to bring to it. And something that I said to Mike was, I kind of said, I want there to be stories about gay people that aren't coming out stories or aren't going through kind of hardship. And obviously there is, a time and a place for those stories, and I think it's important that they are told. But also I want to kind of look to stories where I can see kind of gay role models that are living their life and doing something different, and the challenges that they're facing in the story maybe isn't to do with their identity or their sexuality, but we're just seeing them represented. So I think that's something that I'm kind of maybe keen to bring out in Cooper's Hill. That's great.
I think for me, it's like, in terms of queer stories, for me, I just desperate to see more stories that celebrate the community and the diversities within the community, the people for whom community means a lot, as in the queer community means a lot, for people for whom it doesn't. I want to see all of them, and I think that's really great to hear about how you kind of bring those personal energies into your story.
Thank you. That's the answer.
It's interesting as well. I was just thinking around that in terms of, this idea that, most successful musicals still really, Chess, Chorus Line aside, Rent aside, although I think even Rent is based on a story, most successful musicals are based on a story that already exists, be that historical or fictional. And of course, Patrick, what you're talking about, and Tim with Half and Half, that wasn't true. I mean, to a certain extent, Half and Half was based on a history of Indian restaurants, but and those musicals tend to be less successful if you're kind of or less well known, I think.
Well, it sort of comes back to the sort of two main approaches to a story. It's not just a musical thing now. A story thing generally is that you either take a huge subject and make a small story out of it, or you take a story or a small story and make it huge, so it becomes either an extraordinary tale of everyday folk, or you take a theme. Like, I suppose we took a big theme, which is not just curry, but cultural integration and that whole thing, which is a massive story, isn't it? And then we had to find a smaller story, which I think we did very happily in the end. But that, you either take something big and focus in, don't you, or you find a lovely, beautiful little story, but then you make the thing epic almost. I suppose just turning it into a musical in its own way makes something epic.
And I think there's a lot to be said as well about finding like a uniqueness within the way that you're telling that story as well. And I think that kind of goes back to what Emily Gray was saying in the first episode that we recorded. This content dictating form is such a huge thing that it doesn't, if you aren't going for, based on a film, based on a book, based on a play, whatever, you're finding something that actually makes it unique in its appeal. For some reason, the example that I have in my head is Starlight Express, which is like an odd one, I know, but it's completely unique in its approach, because it's actually not really about anything other than trains, but it was totally successful because it was told in this massive sort of way that we'd never seen before at that time. And I saw it when I was like 5 and I had a great time. So
yeah, well, it's amazing.
You're kind of in a good place with a musical if you can transport an audience instantly to a different world. And obviously in a world where people are whizzing around on roller skates, or even just like suddenly there are cats appearing all around you, you're kind of definitely just thrown into that world, or in the French Revolution or something like that. And I think I think those kind of stories do work really well for musical theatre. If you're going to suspend your disbelief that people are singing, you might as well suspend your disbelief in where you are as a location or time period. But it's interesting kind of, I think every story does need to be told in a certain way, and even stories about more ordinary everyday lives can be told in exciting ways, or through a world that you create.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's particular with musical theatre, isn't it? So we know that, when I'm teaching playwriting, I'm always saying that the more specific you can be, the more universal you'll be. So if you really, really know about that subject and that world, then you can make it universal. So historically, Wales has not always been that great at developing its own talent. And I'm thinking particularly of Ivan Novello, who was, the most successful, musicals writer of the early part of the 20th century, and he of course had to go to London to make his career, and we can all name 50 other people for whom that was true as well. I mean, even in our own time, you look like Gary Owen had his first play, I think, done here in Cardiff by Script Cymru, but then went and was developed in Scotland and in London. You have both chosen to pursue your careers here in Cardiff, and I guess I'm interested in what about this setting is helpful to someone working in musical theatre. And then almost as a supplementary question, and this has come up already, is does that connect with the amateur tradition at all that's here, and which I know that you've both been involved in to smaller or lesser extents.
Yeah, I think it was interesting, the whole kind of chosen to pursue musical theatre in Wales, and I definitely kind of feel that now, but there has been times I kind of did some studying of musical theatre writing in London, and there was a time when I felt like I hadn't found a community here and needed to go to London in order to kind of find that community. But now that I'm kind of here and I've kind of done that journey, it is really nice and exciting developing new writing here. I still have connections with London, like Mike Stocks, who I write with. He's a London-based composer. But I think that, the amateur dramatic world that you mentioned, I think, is really important. I think that there's lots of people that I met there that have gone on to, perform in musicals and either take things completely professionally or semi-professional. And those are a lot of the people that I've been developing my musicals with. So I think, almost having that community and having people that are used to going to see musicals, whether that be professional or amateur, I think does create that audience when you want to develop things yourself.
I think you're right. We've sort of mentioned a few times now the sort of the amateur musical theatre tradition in South Wales. You have it all over the UK. It's particularly strong, I think, in South Wales. But it is funny. It's almost particularly from people that work in professionally, they can be very disparaging about anything that is amateur based. But it's funny. Nobody would ever say that about a male voice choir, or or a brass band. Who are turning out. These are amateur people turning out some of the best music in the country. You hear a top-notch brass band playing either, obviously from Yorkshire or South Wales or in other places as well. The standard is incredibly high. You hear a really good choir, it's absolutely fabulous, and there just isn't that sort of same distinction. But you talk about amateur theatre, and it's like, they're doing Annie Get Your Gun, but I mean, I've had some really good, especially in the realm of pro-am. These almost like you get with the passion plays and things, where you get an amateur cast and a good professional director invited to work with amateur cast, to create these really interesting works. That you see a lot of that from companies like Everyman Theatre. I think back to one project I did many years ago. I was given carte blanche and a bit of money. It wasn't a massive amount of money, but thank you very much. It was a good few £1,000s at a time, and I was very glad to have it. And I was told I could do practically more, as long as they liked the idea of it, I could pretty much do what I wanted. And I said, because I've been doing a lot of work with WNO at the time, I thought I was quite interested in a lot of operatic things. And I said, I know, I want to do a musical version of the Barbara of Seville, but I want to call it the Barbara of Savile Row, and I want to set it in 1950s London with Brill, cream and quiffs. It was a good idea. It's by far from being a perfect piece of theatre, but it was a good basic idea. And they said, go on, do it. And then we had Michael McCarthy from Music Theatre Wales directed it. We did it, and I was paid, really enjoyed it. About 10 years later, I get a phone call from a small professional company in London. It's this tiny professional company called Unexpected Opera, and they'd somehow come across a script of it, or the lighting designer, I think it was, who had worked on ours, had been lighting a show of theirs. And they said, we'd seen this, could you send us a script? And then they toured it around for about the next 18 months. And then I had subsequently more work off that. So there's a really good example of how that amateur scene has nurtured both financially, but also in terms of the performers, something which I'm very proud of, and led to other things. And I know it's just a little experience of my own, but I'm sure there are many thousands of similar situations have occurred and have come out of that. So I do think we should have a slightly more healthy relationship with the amateur theatre scene.
Yeah, no, I think we're all on the same page with this, aren't we? I completely agree. And, and also, as an audience of musical theatre, it gives you the opportunity to see things at scale. I was over at the Lorient Celtic Music Festival with, huge male voice choir. There's no way that, we would be able to tour that, if it was professional. And that's, in some ways regrettable and sad. But it's not just the money. It's the fact that these guys were there, and some women as well were there, and that they brought with them all their humanity and their worldview and their stories from different parts of Wales, and that was part of the experience that the audience were getting, and part of what they related to. And I think that's really true in musical theatre, in amateur theatre, is that you get somebody's life as well. They're bringing that to you on stage, and I love it.
I think it's something that I feel really strongly about, and it's something that kind of frustrates me a little bit, is when people say, Patrick, what do you do for a living? And I say, I'm a musician. I kind of tend to use a broad kind of spectrum, because there's loads of different things I do, and I say I'm a musician, and then people say, are you a professional musician? And that term professional musician, I just feel there's so many grey areas. And
it's like, are you a good musician? It's like, the word professional somehow adds something to it.
It's like I do make my money through being a musician, so you could say that is professional, but there's better pianists out there than I am that wouldn't be considered a professional musician. So it's kind of, there's so many kind of grey areas, and I just think there's just so much talent everywhere that for people to get involved with. So I think it's tricky sometimes when there is that kind of grey area as to what it actually means and people's perceptions of it.
Yes, because you don't want to undermine people's professional careers, because then we get into the whole area of professional actors working for nothing, and obviously these things are a problem. But I think that there are ways of doing things, and amateur work can open up opportunities. for professional work further down the line for people as well, both in terms of the people that are directing and writing, but also performers. There's many performers cut their teeth as amateur performers before going on to amazing careers.
Final question for both of you, Patrick and Tim. What do you want to see happen next in Welsh musical theatre?
I think we'd just like to see some happen, really, wouldn't we, at the moment? We'd just like to see anything happen at the moment. It's not a very useful answer. I'd like to see some good theatre happen, whatever it is, whatever genre it's in. And I don't care whether it's in the style of Andrew Lloyd Webber or whether it's in the style of Sondheim or Jason Roberts Brown, let's just see some really good and exciting and interesting stuff, and stuff that isn't derivative, stuff that's really pushing things along, and because it can be totally commercial, but commercial in an exciting way.
We're on our way out of a pandemic now, so just the whole of theatre needs to kind of return and all of those kind of things. But yeah, I think I'd just love to see just more opportunities for more new musicals. I feel that as we kind of talked about briefly before, there's a big commercial element. The WMC always has these big touring productions, and there's always opportunities to see those works, which is great that happens, and there's more opportunity for that now. And it's nice seeing more modern musicals having the opportunity to be kind of showcased. But it would be really wonderful for some Welsh composers to even just on a small scale, like start developing more shows and allowing audiences to see them.
Amazing. Thank you so much, both of you, Patrick Steed and Tim Riley, and of course today's co-host Rebecca Gould. As we sign off, here is Hold Me Some More by Patrick Steed and Mike Stocks, performed by Jodi Bird.
Could you hold me some more? Why the hurry? It's cold outside. The bed is warm and I am sleepy-eyed. When your clothes were lying on my floor, I thought you'd hold me some more. Could you hold me some more? Stay for pancakes and squeeze my hand and show me that I'm not your one-night stand. Are you pausing now behind that door? Come back and hold me some more. Hold me some more. Once you used to say sex gets in the way of men and women being
Thank you for listening to Leeway 10 Pod Series 2. You can stay up to date on all of our news on Twitter at LeewayProds and by using the hashtag Leeway10Pod. You can also view captioned versions of all of our episodes on our YouTube channel.